Good morning, afternoon, evening to everyone. My name is Sina Bahram. I use he, his, him. I'm a light-skinned male of Persian descent with a very shortly cropped beard and dark wavy hair. Coming to you from Cary, North Carolina, where I live. I'm joined by Corey Timpson. I'll let him do his description in 1 second, but just to say that this is a session on really thinking through the concepts of inclusive design and accessibility and considering them as a methodology, which is something that Corey and I have had a lot of just privilege and experience with in terms of working throughout the sector on to promote these concepts of welcoming everyone, the widest possible audience, to our spaces, be they digital or physical. So we're going to have a campfire discussion. We have some questions and comments already gathered, and we're going to be talking through those. We really want this to be a conversation, so we invite you to use the chat to go off mute and ask your question. And before I turn it over to Corey to do a brief description, please feel free to be comfortable. If you don't want to have your camera on, don't have your camera on. If you need to leave the session and take care of yourself, take care of yourself. This is, we really want to make sure that we're making this an inclusive and welcoming space. So please participate as you are able and as you desire. But with that, let me turn it over to Corey to give a short description of himself, and then we'll dive in.
Yeah, so thank you for that. My name is Corey Timpson, coming to you from Ottawa, Canada. I am a light-skinned man wearing, mid-40s, wearing black framed glasses with a decreasing volume of hair, what seems like by the minute. And I'm wearing one of the 24 different black long sleeve t-shirts that I own.
Awesome.
Back to you.
All right, amazing. Do we have ethos up?
We do now.
Awesome. So, Corey and I start from this ethos. And for those of you who have spoken with us before, I think this might be somewhat familiar, that rather than designing something and then figuring out how to make it accessible, how to make it equitable, how to make it inclusive, which is what happens all the time, right? We want to start by considering the entire vector of human difference from the outset. We want to start with the understanding that we can achieve operational efficiencies, sustainability, interoperability, all of these benefits that we look for, all of these things we use as performance indicators, whether it's on the nonprofit side or whether it's on the for-profit side, by considering inclusivity and the entire vector of difference from the outset, and then by continuing that consideration throughout the entire project. That is it in a nutshell. So the work is a journey, it's never done, but we need to start shifting left these considerations. Otherwise, we're going to be in this constant remediation mode. That is the ethos in a nutshell. Corey, over to you.
Yeah, and maybe I'll just add on to that to say that we consider this ethos in everything we do. So one of the benefits of our work is we get to work on an entire range of projects. That could be policy and protocol development on the administration side, say, of museums and cultural venues. It could be in program development, so educational public programming and events, exhibitions. It could be in terms of capacity building and training. It can be in terms of digital system, digital media design and development and production, et cetera. But this ethos just carries through absolutely everything we do. And taking this ethos, we start with a premise. And that premise is that, we have intentions. It could be the curatorial intent, an interpretive intent. It could be a strategic intent. As a designer, I have design intents. And then, our audience has their own set of intentions. And we want to make sure that these intentions line up as well as possible. So we really want to consider what are our intentions and why we're doing something. Again, writing a policy, creating an exhibition. What are our intentions? And then what are the expected intentions of our audience or the people who are going to use whatever it is that we're doing? And we want to ensure that those line up. When they don't line up, we have barriers. And like when that mismatch happens, and we just want to preemptively mitigate and remove as many of those barriers as possible. So we really take this as this premise as being our responsibility. So we want to know how, our design intent affects response to and facilitates the expectations and intentions of the people that we're working with. So we have our ethos. This is the premise in which we, start from. And then we really have this primary consideration, which is we want to consider the ecosystem in which experiences happen. And that means all the ways in which someone interfaces and interacts within the ecosystem and exists, as well as that underlying infrastructure that supports and enables the ecosystem to take place. So the first sort of thing that we think about today is that users today, our audience today, can currently exist in physical and digital space. So even if we're developing, say, a museum exhibition or museum experience that is non-digital, and if we think back to if anyone was in the Why Do We Digital session that Bruce, Rob, and I had, we really kind of focused a lot on that experience design. Well, it doesn't mean we don't consider the fact that the people within that ecosystem are digitally enabled already. So, this is a very deliberate point of departure. When we think about the ecosystem, we want to think about the fact that people are coexisting in digital and physical environments at the same time. And this is just a baseline that we begin with. Because then what we do is take our ecosystem and break it down into a number of facets, and we strategically and deliberately consider each one of those facets. That's, information systems and how those information systems get presented. The environmental and built design. And maybe I'll just step back and give an example. If you can imagine walking through museum space, not only are you getting content information, you're getting building code and life safety information, you're getting service information, you're getting wayfinding information. All of these different information systems are coexisting within a space. And there's an opportunity for us to think deliberately about those different systems and how they can support and enable one another instead of compete with one another, and contribute to a more inclusive and accessible experiential outcome for our audience. Environmental built design, I don't think we need to provide a number of examples. That's everything from exhibitry to furniture, so on and so forth. Interface design is another facet. Now, we think interface design, particularly at MCN, we're probably thinking of graphical user interfaces, but we're thinking about tangible interfaces, human interactivity. There's a number of different interfaces that we have in the built environment and within the digital environment. Content design and development, how we're creating content, what are the reading levels, what is the hierarchy of information, how are these things structured? This is an important facet within the ecosystem. Software design and development, the semantic structures that enable software to be usable by a screen reader, for example, those are really important. They're the same tactics that allow systems to be interoperable and scalable. Media design and production, if we're thinking about time-based or linear media, what are the affordances, American Sign Language, captioning, audio description, transcription, volume control, so on and so forth. Are we developing those affordances within media design and development? Fabrication and installation, something may be fully thought of and baked within the design development process, but is that how it gets fabricated and installed on site? I mean, we have all worked on a number of projects. Projects get siloed for very good reasons. At the live, launch event, things get pulled together. And so when we want to think about what is the as-built scenario versus what our intentions were and ensuring that, we mitigate any gaps there. Soft tactics, we're going to make poor decisions at times. How do we fill in those gaps with soft tactics? Things like large print binders at visitor services, so on and so forth. The spaces and the museum projects and practices we put in place all involve people. People are those who work for museums, they're volunteers, there are patrons, so on and so forth. So we really want to think about people as an important part of the ecosystem and how people are equipped for success, and services and accommodations, visitor services, so on and so forth. But why we listing all of these things is because we really need to take this holistic view of the ecosystem if we truly want something to be inclusive and through our methodology, thereby accessible. Imagine a media piece of documentary film that has captioning in American Sign Language, an audio description built into a digital kiosk that has an inaccessible interface sitting in the physical constraints of a kiosk and gallery that is not wheelchair accessible or has no knee clearance. So a chair user has to come up and use it sideways. This is why the ecosystem matters, because we could have the best of intentions in one silo, one sphere within that ecosystem, and then really miss out on what it is we're trying to accomplish. So we tried to sort of solicit some comments and questions before the session, trying to think about different facets of these ecosystems that we can of the ecosystem that we can touch on. And so maybe we can just jump right into the first topic, unless Sina, is there anything?
No, I read it away.
Okay, cool. So first topic was, and this is, paraphrase, some of the topics were pretty long. Being inclusive and equitable is not a methodology, but an axiology, acting in service of equity to realize a shift in value. So this was someone who kind of challenged the idea of the inclusive design methodology.
And I think there's a salient point here, right? That we are talking about a methodology because it's something that we have a lot of experience with across a variety of sectors and organization types and sizes, et cetera. But I want to take a step back because I think the person who asked this is absolutely correct. There are a few things to consider. We live in a deeply ableist world, right? We live in environments that are incredibly disabling, and that is through a lack of consideration at the design and build and operational phases. There's a myriad of reasons for why that is true. And it's not just, ableist, right? We see throughout MCN and other conferences, and just by using our observational skills around the world, that we live in a world that is truly not equitable for a variety of people. So then it brings up this consideration of what are the ways in which we can work to change that state of affairs. Now, on the tactical side, this methodology of inclusive design is one that not only Corey and I believe in, but we have evidence-based reasons for believing it because we've enacted it at various scales and seen the positive outcomes that comes out of that. So from that perspective, at the tactical scale, it's highly effective. It's highly implementable at different, operational sizes, and it's something that is constantly growing because we're iterating on it. It's not perfect. We only claim that it is always better the next time we do it, right? However, let's talk about the other side of this comment in question, which is, we are in organizations where folks sometimes, well, not sometimes, always, everybody is in a different place in their journey. Some folks come to this work of inclusion because it's the right thing to do. Others come to it because they were told by legal that they must do it, right? There's a legal burden to it. Others come to it because they see their colleagues and peers doing this work and start understanding the reasoning for it. Yet others come to it because it's just a factor of best practice, right? There's all of these different reasons, and people exist in different parts of that journey. So we don't wish to imply that this methodology is all you need. End of talk. Let's all go home. Great MCN session. We're done, right? That is, nothing could be further from the truth. This methodology is a tool that allows us to then facilitate those intentions that we were talking about earlier, be they moral, be they emotional, be they intellectual, whatever your reasoning is. And we also need to realize that this is not the only part of the work. The work consists of changing hearts and minds through powers of example, through bringing people along for the journey and not beating them up for having made mistakes in the past, but also about being firm that this is not optional, right? I reject this notion that this work comes out of charity or that this work comes out of a desire to do something for those people. Right? It's 2021, and we need to move on past this antiquated mindset. This work is necessary if we are going to actually exist as a species where we consider that every single person brings value as a creative being and as someone who should have a role in society. And if that is true, then we need to start implementing the principle of inclusion at whatever scale makes sense, and then being kind with ourselves and understanding that it's not going to be perfect the first time, which is why we believe so much in iteration, in rapid prototyping, and in failing forward, right? So there's that aspect of the work as well. And that's why this comment about it being an axiology and a lens through which to consider the world is absolutely correct. And it's something that every single person on this call can contribute to, whether you are a technical person, a content person, a management person, because there are things in your life, whether they are personal or professional, that you can contribute to helping to build that more inclusive world.
And And Sina, you're getting like applause on the chat.
Oh,
And
thanks.
Jeremy, who submitted the question, is saying like that, thank you. That's where he thought the session was going. And it just like, we had a really good talk about your question, Jeremy,
Yeah.
comment, because like, we always have to find the sort of point of relevance in which we speak to, you know, people that we're working with on various projects. And when we're working with like a really large organization, and it's like, this is where the budget line like just really starts to grate us, like, oh, there's no budget line for accessibility in your project. It's like, deep, okay, who are we speaking with and how do we make them sort of see the relevance that we see when we're going through these things? So if we're talking to the CFO of a really large museum, we may talk about the fact that 1 in 4 people in the world has a disability, that 1 in 2 people over the age of 35 will encounter a disability in their lifetime. We'll talk about intersectionality and all of the things that this means, where accessibility is often like not thought about being an intersectional, you know, concept. And just that's the sort of discussion with the CFO, what the return on performance indicators might be when you consider, you know, a much larger audience and breadth as well as depth. But we might have a very different conversation when we talk about like a digital developer or designer, because there is a real opportunity for interoperability, scalability, and innovation within the inclusive design methodology in those sectors. So relevance is really important, and also we're sort of preoccupied. The second kind of comment I wanted to add, we're preoccupied with this idea of the role of museums, museums being the most trusted sources of knowledge, how they evolve over time, understanding that museums come from a colonial past and history, and how do we kind of get rid of all of the crap and like innovate within the idea of what a museum is. And if museums want to, you know, be stewards of the public's history and knowledge, then recognizing who that public is and how the museum best serves that public in which it's supposed to be serving is critical. And that's why, like, when we kind of truncated your comment, acting in service, you know, was like just a phrase that really kind of stood out to us, because this is the role of museums. And if museums want to continue having an important role, then considering, you know, who they're acting for is of critical importance. And it just seems like, you know, now's the time to really, for us to hit that inflection point and really break things open.
Jeremy, I want to invite, and no pressure, by the way. So if you're cool, no worries at all. But if you want to go off mute or on camera or on the chat, if you have anything to add or want to ask a follow-up, since this was your question and comment, just want to honor that. So if you have anything to contribute, please chime in, but no pressure. Okay, hearing nothing. Awesome. So from anybody else, let's open it up. Any questions, comments, assertions, anything at all to what we just talked about before moving on to the next topic? And it's not final. If you think of something 20 minutes in and want to revisit a point, by all means, that we're happy to do it. But just want to make space for that. And I think everybody has the ability to go off mute or chime in. Any questions or comments on this before we move to the next thing? Or follow-up questions, etc. And I'll leave a moment in time for that. Okay, hearing none. Oh, can't talk right now, Jeremy says, but thanks. You're quite welcome. Thank you for the question. It was fantastic. Corey, next one.
Yep. So this one is balancing institutional transformation with day-to-day tactics that will make a difference. So yeah, this was much longer sort of scenario based question or comment that was really about the challenge of trying to sort of be an agent of change within an organization and develop this transformation within the organization, while also trying to develop tactics on like a project sort of your, you know, day in the life, like work day basis that make a difference. So how do you sort of balance these two, you know, aspects to creating a more inclusive environment?
So I think I've got half of this one and you've got half of this one, Corey. So I'll, internally at an organization, there are many competing deadlines and factors and forces and desires that are at play, much like is true, frankly, within all of us as individuals in the different roles and identities we bring to spaces and in the different aspirations we try to achieve in our lives. And I think it's really important to first take a moment and recognize that, but then also to understand that I think actually a perfect example of this is, I don't know if folks are familiar with the disability pride flag, but one of the things on it, the lines on it are jagged lightning bolts. And if you're not familiar with why that is, it's to represent the path of progress. And the path of progress, especially for persons with disabilities, is so often, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Sometimes it's actually 2 steps forward and 1.8 steps back, right? But it is heading in a positive direction. And so that's really important because I think we get hung up a lot on using the wrong Zoom level, if you will, when measuring progress at an organization. And then we also don't put in practices in place, and Corey's going to talk on this point, to ensure that those steps back happen less and less. Those regressions happen less and less. That's why we believe so strongly in this methodology. So what's an example of that? An example of that is we've gone on for a few decades without having audio description in our videos. Fine, that's a reality. Let's say it, let's name it, let's make sure we understand why that is bad, and then what can we do to fix it? The solution is not move hell or high water and fix everything overnight. It's not possible, it's not feasible. It only is going to disrupt everything else. It's going to actually cause a lot of friction and phrase accessibility and inclusion in a negative light, etc. The solution, however, is also not to honor the fact that everyone is doing their best and we should just be patient, because that strategy is one that I think the disability community and many other marginalized groups tried for a few decades. And with all due respect, it doesn't work. So what's the thing in the middle? The thing in the middle is to put in steps that are measurable and reproducible in a data-based, in an evidence-based way, so that we can move the organization forward. That speaks, Corey mentioned policy, right? Tools, tactics, all of these things are possible to be put into place to slowly move things forward, but to prevent them from slipping back. Let's put in a media accessibility policy. Let's look at our procurement practices and build accessibility right in, right? Let's understand that compliance has nothing to do with inclusion. Part of this question, Corey, I believe, referred to the ADA. Part of this question or the previous one referred to the ADA. Let's be very clear. The Americans with Disabilities Act is one of the most noted and lauded pieces of civil rights legislation that humanity has ever created, right? This is an objective fact. It also is the bare minimum that you can do in 2021 so as to simply exist as an organization. It has been federal law for 31 years. The ADA does nothing about inclusion. It barely does anything about accessibility, right? So we need to be really clear on this point. There's a common question, in fact, this was referenced in one of the comments we received, where I'm paraphrasing, but it went something like this. 25% of my colleagues say, but we're ADA compliant, so aren't we totally accessible? And the answer is very simple. No, you're not. You're not accessible. You're not inclusive at all, but you're also not accessible. Because if you have a building in which there is a ramp, congratulations, and somebody in a wheelchair can come in, but the exhibitry has touch screens outside of a reachable zone, right? Or doesn't have affordances for those who are deaf and use American Sign Language as their primary language, then you're not accessible. We haven't even begun talking about inclusion yet. You're simply not accessible. And so we need to understand that compliance and conformance, and this is true in the digital space for those who are familiar with the web content accessibility guidelines and similar, Apple's accessibility guidelines and so on and so forth. Same exact thing I'm saying applies there as it applies to building code, which is that this is the bare minimum, right? This is what a group of people were able to agree on as the lowest common denominator through a series of compromise 31 years ago. That is what the ADA is. It is incredibly helpful. It is the reason that my friends who use wheelchairs can have a drink with me at a bar. But it is absolutely nothing to do with inclusion. And so we need to understand that and then move the conversation forward from legal compliance into actually doing the work of equity and making these environments truly inclusive. And what does that mean? It brings us back to this methodology of including and considering the entire vector of human difference from the beginning. So that's the point on like sort of ADA and so forth. I'll make one other point before turning it over to Corey, which is, how do you do that? How do you enact cultural and actionable change within organizations where every single person is in a different place in their journey, where projects have been defined with milestones and goals far before maybe some of these conversations were going on and are continuing to be defined afterwards? And that is why we have tactics that we work with a variety of partners and collaborators on internal working groups around inclusion and accessibility, right? And I want to make a point on this. DEIA is where accessibility goes to die. And I just want to be really like, particular about that. And I hope to be precise about this point. That's not to say that DEIA is not incredible work, but in all of in the last 20 client conversations Corey and I have had, there has been a recurring theme that the following happened, without naming names. Our organization, because of the events of 2020 and 2021 with respect to racial diversity in this country, has renewed its effort on DEIA work. Actually, we're lucky if we get the A. Usually it's DEI work. Therefore, these topics are super important. Awesome, wonderful. This is a great opener. I mean, this is like, yes, excellent. And then what happens? There's a concentration on those things where the board and executives leadership see there being pressure from society. It's not to say that we don't need to make sure that our environments are not inclusive and accessible for our Black and brown colleagues and gender equity and all of these other topics that are important, right? There's no hierarchy of oppression. Let's be very clear here. But what I am trying to say is each of those topics, not just accessibility, each of those topics deserves its own working group in addition to the broad level of consideration that may be happening at a DEIA working group in a museum, or to use more corporate terminology, at an ERG, an employee resource group at a large corporation. So make sure that when you're organizing these structures in your organization, when you're creating these collaborative environments in your organization, that you are able to not only have broad conversations, but then to have those tactical conversations that are not just strategic in the individual areas, and then for these conversations to inform and build off of one another. And then lastly, it can't only be done inside. The work needs to include the audiences we're trying to serve better and who have previously been excluded from these spaces. And that means working with communities and engaging with persons with disabilities and all of the other groups that we're talking about externally, so that these solutions are not only prototyped and informed by visitor experience and by real world considerations, but also so that the act of having those conversations informs and helps elevate the discourse around this work so that folks understand why it matters and who they're doing it with and for. And persons with disabilities especially are so often excluded from the solutions that are built for them. And this is why we need to make sure that we're designing by, for, and with the groups that we are trying to serve better. So those are the notes on the organizational side. Corey, maybe over to you for a little bit of like the methodology into that issue.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of don't even know where to begin because that was awesome, Sina. I think like there's just a few things for us to consider. We mentioned a few times now in various order, but let's say policy, protocols and procedures, standards, and then tools and tactics. And if we think about those as in an organizational hierarchy, they all mean different things, but they all work together in order to create an institutional backbone and a support that can be applied across any of the activities that an organization is running. So those all sort of need to be crafted and put in place, and most importantly, iterated upon. Sina mentioned failing forward earlier, I think in the previous question. This is something that we just take to heart. So how do we work on transformation and day-to-day activities at the same time? Well, as an example of one thing that we do is we develop roadmaps. So roadmaps aren't about being a project schedule. There's no dates on things. It's all about like a sequencing of activities because we want to make deliberate decisions. We want to use the finite resources that any organization already has, and resources being budget, people's time, and schedules that exist. So we want to be deliberate in those spends and use them as efficiently and wisely as possible to help move the organization forward in a strategically sound manner to increase inclusivity and accessibility as we move along. Not overburdening anybody, but being really wise on how we consume our resources in a sequenced in a sequenced order that makes sense. So like that's kind of like how we develop the backbone. And that may mean that on a daily basis, you're doing some of these tactics, putting some of these tactics in place that are in very, very narrow scopes. But overall, you're learning what the outcome of those scopes may be, what we can learn from it and evolve and move forward. And you're chipping away at a larger picture. When we talk about our ethos and the premise and consideration of the ecosystem, that's what we do every time we come into a project. But Sina and I may get brought into the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, like we were a few years ago, where they're getting 4,000 people a day. It's like 600,000 square feet. It's exhibitions that have been designed, developed over 100 years. And like, how do you make that accessible? Well, they're not going to shut down for 4 years while we just design and develop a whole new museum. That doesn't make sense. We're going to have to be really deliberate in how we sequence the activities, chip away at things day by day, and know that we're going to create a larger and we're going to build inertia. We're going to build momentum and develop a greater impact as we move forward. So
Jeremy,
I think,
oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were done. No, finish that thought, and then I'll say something.
So I mean, I think like there's very practical sort of example of like road mapping things so that we're sequencing activities and being deliberate in our resource spend. And then there's also, Sina, I wanted to build off of the, engaging communities.
Oh, yeah.
This is something that we've done at a number of institutions now. And just really quickly, we develop a working group that works inside the museum. The working group must be represented by all departments. Finance department, like at the Human Rights Museum, was like, okay, we don't need to be involved in this. Luckily, I had the authority in my position there to be able to say, well, no, you're going to be involved in this. And I like picking on finance because they became super involved in the working group, and it was a great participation long term.
They actually ended up sending multiple people to that meeting after all.
Yeah, there was 2 people from the finance team on the inclusive design working group. Now, that group gets paired with an external advisory committee. This is really important to define terms of reference because, we don't want to say like the museum's compromising its curatorial authority or anything like that by engaging an external group. But we want to develop those terms and then work together in partnership. This is a really great tactic for making these informed decisions, to building an awareness and a sensitivity and starting to develop the corporate culture that goes along. The diverse, the sharing of ownership and responsibility with external groups, as well as interdepartmentally and through multidisciplinary working group team, means you're setting yourself up for scalability. You're setting yourself up to make more informed decisions because you have a number of various perspectives sitting around the table. And while it's great to have a champion, and champions are critically important, the load must be shared. Like we went through that ecosystem facets, and all of those areas, all of those different facets may represent, different departments within the museum. They all need to be brought together. And I mean, we could probably continue talking, but let's see. There's
Jeremy had if you want to read that out, just for good accessibility practice, and I have a comment for it. But Jeremy had a follow up in the chat.
Yeah. So part of the question of institutional transformation makes me ask, is it easier at this point in 2021 to replace leadership who need all of this explained from the beginning, or to continue to educate those that are willing to interrogate their practice?
So I have a couple of comments on this. If we take the approach of simply replacing because we want to bring in other folks who are doing the work, or who may have a lesser need to have it explained to them, we have not implemented reproducibility into our practices. So I'm gonna slightly at a tangent approach the topic that you're getting at. I believe personally what is necessary is that we need to weave inclusion and accessibility into the metrics that we use to evaluate performance. And Corey and I do this all the time on procurement policy and on all these other things. We need to do that with hiring practices. And we need to do that with evaluations, whether it's of CEOs and C-suite executives in for-profit companies or for senior leadership at museums. And by the way, boards that don't take this seriously, especially in the for-profit space, are doing so at their own peril. One of the personal investment strategies actually that I use is that women-owned businesses and those who employ more persons with disabilities and females at higher rates, at higher levels in the organization actually outperform the S&P. Right? This is like there's data on this. This is no longer inspirational things that we're talking about. I don't care about inspiration because it fades. Inspiration fades after the emotion, lessens. Actions have the ability to be sustainable. That's why we keep harping on that. This, Corey has said the word informed and deliberate decision-making, oh my God, more times than I could count, right? Because that's why it's so vital. So what I think we should do is, we should recognize that at a certain point, for example, in 2021, certain concepts should be considered baseline. And if folks are not willing to play ball, similar to how vaccine mandates are being handled in this country, then we need to get rid of them. However, we need to do so in a way that is not capricious or arbitrary, but that enforces and allows the organization to grow towards the path of inclusion. And that means enacting policies that are applicable to all and facilitating the ability for those who want to grow and those who can learn to do better to be able to do so. That's one aspect of it. The second aspect of it is that none of this matters if we're talking about a 99% white male-driven, cisgendered crowd. So we need to have representational diversity and inclusion if we're going to succeed as a sector and as a people. And that means hiring practices, that means promotions, that means recognizing how we evaluate internally and extrinsically as well. And lastly, we need to understand that this change does happen slowly, but we need to, again, and I said this earlier, not use that as an excuse. Slowly doesn't mean zero, right? I want to delineate between that. We can be reasonable in our expectations, but once that is done, there is no more further room for compromise because the compromise has occurred and we're being fair on both sides, but we need to first remediate the mistakes of the past while moving forward in a sustainable way. So no, I don't believe we should, arbitrarily get rid of everyone, but what I do believe we need to do is put in policies in place where those folks who are going to be obstacles towards progress will be phased out by virtue of not complying with those policies that are enacted through consensus and by community building within the organizations. Because I don't want to also imply that what is good for Museum A is necessarily good for Museum B. And we want to be very careful of that, which is why these policies should grow from the inside, but we better make sure that they're not enacted by only the folks who are affected by the policies at the top. These policies need to be arrived at through consensus building and through an inclusive practice, right? If we're trying to be inclusive for everyone, then everyone needs to participate in that inclusion.
And I think that we've just considered it part of our job, no matter what project we're working on, that, educating, and I kind of hate to phrase it, like educating the partners we're working with is just going to be a necessary part of what we're doing. But, we're also, we don't believe we have all the answers. We're probably two people who work in this area, way more, think about it way more than a lot of people do, but we're always learning every single day from the partners that sometimes we are, quote, educating, we're working with Baltimore Museum, Baltimore Museum of Art. And when we think about the erasure concepts that Sina was just talking about, they just finished collecting new acquisitions by female artists only. Amazing. Like, is there, what else can we do along those lines so that, if museums are built upon a collection, that the collection is starting to become more representative of what the public is. We're also working with Boise Art Museum, 14 full-time staff at Boise Art Museum, and they're doing amazing work in inclusive design and accessibility, and we're learning from them as we're learning from one another. And so, I really think that like education is a two-way street, and it's just going to be part of this. I think if there's, becoming an obstacle is one thing. If no one has the will, because along with deliberate decision-making, informed deliberate decision-making, the other thing you'll hear Sina and I talk about all the time is it really just takes the will. It doesn't take a budget line to be accessible. It takes the will to change how you're doing things and thinking about the things you're doing. And if we're starting a new exhibition design or a new software development project and it's net new, it's not costing us anything additional to make it accessible. It is a deliberate consideration that we have to make on how to be inclusive, and delineating between inclusive and accessible is important because we don't want segregation. I think we can all say segregation is bad. And, in this case, if we're thinking about the ADA and we're saying, okay, well, if that part of the counter way down there is, 3 inches shorter for, a wheelchair user, go use that. Why isn't the whole counter just 3 inches shorter? Is there a really good reason why it shouldn't be? And then maybe just everyone can use the counter together. So it'll be accessible and inclusive. And so there's a lot for us to do here, but the will, I think, is critical. Education is just going to have to be a thing that we do. Unfortunately, the bar is really low. The first exhibition that we developed that used tactile audio described photography, when we tested it with user groups, the visitors who are blind and low vision were like blown away. The comments were glowing and just incredible, and no reason for me to go to an art gallery before camp. Now, the second time we did this application, Sina had the idea of including guided tactile audio descriptions so that, you move your hand up the left of the image and feel, that kind of thing. Well, when we tested it again with the same audiences, further blown away. Now, they only gave us like incredibly positive reviews after the first exhibition. But with the second one, it was like, oh, this is so much better. And so like, this is where the iteration is really important and learning from one another. So education, I think, is just a critical piece, and it's multi-directional.
There's also a concept of burden I want to talk about.
We have like 1 minute, I think.
Let me see here. No, we have until 2:15, no? 1:15 to 2, or am I wrong about that?
We should probably know the answer. Keep going though.
Okay, I'll keep going. Somebody can inform us. 1 minute, check. Okay, well, if that's the case, then really quick on burden. Please do not rely on folks who might carry a certain identity as putting the burden on them for education. I'm very open about it. I happen to be blind and I talk about this stuff all the time. I'll educate anybody about anything I'm qualified to do so. That's something I have signed up for. But just like it's not appropriate to ask your Black colleagues to comment on a racial issue that's going on right now, don't put that burden on persons with disabilities that haven't shown up for the work. That's why Corey's comment about terms of reference was so important, because then when we have an advisory group, those are persons with disabilities and intersectional identities that are joining together and are showing up to play that role. But don't put that on someone just because they carry an identity, because that's not what they're showing up for. They're showing up to be a banker, to be an executive, to be a documenter, to be a programmer, not to be a blind person commenting on accessibility. Right? I happen to play that role and wear multiple hats because I've signed up for it. But I just wanted to make that point. Since we only have a few seconds left, I just want to say thank you. Thank you to all of you. So much gratitude for spending your time with us and for thinking about these things. And if Corey and I can do anything to help you in service of promoting inclusion and equity in anything that you do, please do not hesitate to reach out. I hope you have a beautiful rest of your conference.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.